All right, finishing up that last part. Here in purple, these are the descending tracts. Notice the arrows coming down from the brain, issuing motor commands to synapse with neurons, motor neurons, to reach like the muscles or the effectors, right? Descending tracts. Notice they're coming down in the white matter columns somewhere. And then in green, notice the arrows, ascending tracts, sending sensory input up into the brain for interpretation and evaluation and processing. And again, the ascending tracts are just somewhere in the white columns. Okay? The spinal nerves. We have 31 pairs. They're all mixed, meaning they have both sensory and motor neurons, or their fibers at least. Oh, here we go. All right. Sensory input. There's a spinal nerve. There's the dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, sensory or afferent pathway, interneurons within the gray matter. There's the cell bodies of the motor neurons, efferent or motor pathway to the effectors. So, spinal nerve, because it contains both sensory and motor neurons. We have 8 spinal nerves. C1 through C8, breakfast at 8. Remember when we did the vertebral column, we only have 7 cervical vertebrae. So that was an earlier breakfast. Okay, 12 thoracic, right? Lunch at 12. 12 thoracic spinal nerves, T1 through T12. 5 lumbar, just like we saw with the lumbar vertebrae, we have 5 lumbar spinal nerves. Early separate 5, L1 through L5. Also 5 sacral spinal nerves, S1 through S5, the sacrum. And then down in the coccyx, we have 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. Total of 31. 31 pairs. So let's look at the overall structure of a spinal nerve and a somewhat similar arrangement of structures as we saw in a muscle. There's the, in terms of connective tissue envelopments or layers, there's the epineurium, epi for like on top of, neurium, neuri for nerve or neuron. So it's the outermost fibrous connective tissue layer here surrounding an entire nerve. If this was a muscle, these would be the fascicles, and that would be the epimysium. Excuse me. But this is a nerve, and notice the terminology is still fascicle, except instead of muscle fibers, it's nerve axons or fibers inside a fascicle. The outermost connective tissue layer, epineurium. Within that, there are the fascicles surrounded by the perineurium. Here you go. All right, connective tissue envelopment around one nerve fascicle. And then innermost, the fascicle, bundle of axons or nerve fibers. Notice this is a myelinated axon, myelinated by a Schwann cell, so this is out in the peripheral nervous system. As you see here, it's external to the spinal cord. So yeah, that makes sense. And then lastly, the endoneurium, connective tissue surrounding layer, surrounding an axon. So one axon is surrounded by the myelin sheath created by the Schwann cell, if it's myelinated, and that is surrounded by the endoneurium. A grouping of axons is a fascicle. See multiple fascicles here. It is surrounded, each fascicle is surrounded by the perineurium. And then all the fascicles are bundled together in one structure called the nerve, and it is surrounded by the epineurium, externalmost. Go back and look at the muscle cross-section, and it has a similar setup. Okay, so let's look at the distribution of the spinal nerves once we are moving further away from the spinal cord. So there's your spinal cord, centrally located into the vertebral or spinal canal within the vertebrae. The roots, so here's anterior, here's posterior. So there's the dorsal root and there's the anterior root. They merge to form a spinal nerve. The spinal nerve exits the spinal column at the intravertebral foramina. That's one of them, so that's a foramen. And then once that spinal nerve is further out, outside of the vertebral column, away from the spinal cord, it branches. So there are dorsal and ventral roots. They form the spinal nerves, and then the nerves branch. There's, to keep it simple, there's a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. Dorsal meaning back, ventral meaning anterior. Here's posterior, back. So then this thing coming back is the dorsal or posterior ramus, back towards the musculature of the back, your back muscles, okay? Or there's the ventral ramus, the other one. Even though it's not necessarily shooting out anteriorly, but it's the ventral ramus or anterior ramus, okay? There's the dorsal ramus and there's the ventral ramus, the two principal branchings of each spinal nerve. So now we're looking at a similar thing, zooming out a little bit, except it's been flipped around. Here's posterior, dorsal, here's anterior, ventral. Now in this figure, it's flipped around. There's the spinous process, so that's posterior, dorsal towards your back. And then here's anterior, ventral towards your front. Okay? There's the spinal cord. Notice there's the big obvious dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, ventral root. They merge, spinal nerve, and then going dorsally, there's the posterior ramus or dorsal ramus, and then the other one, the anterior or ventral ramus. Okay, so the dorsal rami, meaning plural, innervate the deep skeletal muscles of the back. The ventral rami innervate the ventrolateral body surface, meaning towards the front and laterally, and the body wall, and then the limbs, the upper and lower limbs. So there's more body structures to innervate by the ventral rami. Notice that they are considerably thicker and bigger than the dorsal rami. Okay? Which you see up here, by the way, the rami communicans and the sympathetic trunk ganglia. This is part of the autonomic nervous system that we'll cover in a subsequent chapter. Excuse me. There's the posterior ramus, anterior ramus, and that singular rami is plural. Okay, let's look at motor commands of the peripheral nerves. So motor commands, okay? There's somatic voluntary. So again, this is such a wonderful landmark. Dorsal root ganglion, dorsal, so that's sensory. That means that's the ventral root, that's motor. So these are the motor neuron, their cell bodies, so those are motor commands coming out. So somatic voluntary. Think of your skeletal muscles. Okay, voluntary skeletal commands. That's color-coded here in pink or red. And notice skeletal muscles of the body, wall, and limbs. You know, you picture kitty cat. There you go. That's the motor command. Or you're gonna keep your skeletal muscles nice and contracted or erect if you're sitting straight up in your chair. Skeletal muscles to the back. Right here in pink. Somatic muscle commands, voluntary. That's just showing you the pathway. Okay? Ventral rami, dorsal rami. Okay? Visceral involuntary. Okay? Still motor commands, color-coded in blue, but visceral body, meaning things that you don't have to concern yourself with. The heart rate, churning of your stomach to digest your food, that sort of thing. Okay? Notice glands, visceral organs in the thoracic cavity, abdominal pelvic viscera, smooth muscle glands, and visceral organs, color-coded in blue. And the reason this is now in black here, right, fibrous smooth muscle glands and of the back, It's just showing you how this visceral motor neuron synapses in the sympathetic ganglion. So what's a ganglion? Clustering of cell bodies, in this case, visceral motor neurons that are controlling involuntary effectors. Okay? And again, much of this we will see when we do the autonomic nervous system in a subsequent chapter. Okay? But just involuntary visceral motor commands. Okay, now sensory input going up into the brain, essentially. Somatic. Oh, let's do somatic first. So again, dorsal root ganglion, sensory input into the central nervous system, right? Somatic, from interoceptors of body wall and limbs, so internal sensory neurons. Somatic here is in pink, visceral is in purple or lavender. So from exteroceptors, from the external environment. You're petting your cat, it feels nice and smooth. That's because those exteroreceptors are modified, evolved to detect texture. Okay? Or proprioceptors, a positioning of the limbs. Okay? Or exteroreceptors from the back. The mosquito lands on your back, you're going to feel that. Okay? So here color-coded in red, that's sensory input into the central nervous system. Okay? From interoreceptors from the back, let's say stretch receptors in your back muscles, that's going in sensory input. From interoreceptors from the body wall and or the limbs, again, position of the stretch of the musculature, sensations from the abdominal cavity, sensory input coming in, visceral organs, right? Sensory input coming in, dorsal root ganglion, it has to be sensory into the central nervous system. Somatic and visceral. Okay, the concept of skin maps or dermatomes. Derma, remember dermis for skin? So specific segments of your skin are innervated, supplied by specific spinal nerves. Remember the 31 pairs of spinal nerves come off the spinal cord, and they extend out and they branch and they innervate certain regions of the skin. All spinal nerves except for C1 innervate a particular section of skin. So the skin can then be divided into what are called sensory zones or segments, and that is also called a dermatome map. So let's say that mosquito lands on your shoulder and bites you there. Well, that tells you what spinal nerve, in terms of a sensory nerve, is going to detect that. Spinal nerve C4. Okay? If you're petting your kitty cat, the texture of the cat's fur is picked up, let's focus on the fingers, by a few spinal nerves. C7, T1, and C8. Those are the spinal nerves in terms of sensory neurons that are innervating the skin on your fingers. Okay? Or you're studying at night and the cat brushes up against your side of your calf, right? Spinal nerve sacral 1 on the side of your calf there. See? Back and front. So it's clinically important because it can indicate damage to spinal nerves. Okay, so let's say you're petting your cat and for some reason you realize, hey, that's weird, I can't really feel anything on my pinky. Then you like scratch your pinky and it's like, I can see myself scratching it, but I don't feel anything on the skin really. That's weird. Clinically, that can indicate damage to thoracic spinal nerve 1 that's innervating that region of skin. Okay? Or notice kind of that inner part of the forearm. So loss of sensation in a particular segment of skin on the dermatome is clinically important because it's indicative of damage to a particular spinal nerve. Okay, nerve plexuses. So what's a plexus? A network of interwoven ventral rami. Remember, there's dorsal rami that go to the back, the ventral rami, ventrolateral, and into the limbs. So these are the interwoven ventral rami of the spinal nerves.